Okay, week 8 in read 436. We're focusing on the cognitive lens or theory of reading acquisition and comprehension. You may recall in your Kusser textbook that the textbook is organized by two frames, one cognitive and one sociocultural. We're going to tackle the first one in the next 2 weeks, and then we'll tackle sociocultural perspective in the remaining weeks of the course. So we've been hitting on this all semester really about the relationship between individuals and context in relation to reading, understanding. And so I want to talk a bit about the cognitive piece and how it approaches, how those theorists approach the reading process. So you can see here on the screen, I've sort of listed some of the major tenets of the cognitive approach. And there's this real emphasis on the individual in the cognitive piece. When we look at sociocultural, we'll obviously consider the context and the ways in which people interact with activity and environment. But the cognitivists were really focused on individuals. And one way to think about that is the analogy that they often use, which is the brain as a computer, right? This idea about processing information, and that information includes language as well as the meaning of the work as well. So but you're thinking about a computer that sort of does zeros and ones, the same thought can be around reading and decoding the alphabetic script. We'll look at the sociocultural context later, and they'll look at the brain as kind of an ecosystem instead. But you can also see here this idea here that the brain is malleable or trainable, right? This idea that you can be taught how to do certain aspects of reading. So one thing you'll see on the screen here is I note expert practice. That was a major focus of the cognitivists, to say what do great readers do, and then can we actually find ways to teach that to novice or less abled readers. So I want to review some of the visual models we've looked at all semester, because they're going to tell us a bit about what it is that's happening here in the cognitive piece. You remember here the RTAC model, right? The text, activity, reader, and context piece. Now, the cognitivist focus is going to be on the reader, in particular, their brain, right? But that's not to say that it doesn't also involve the ways in which that reader, that brain, interacts with the text and activity. But they're significantly less interested in the context of it, because this idea about reading as an individualistic pursuit. So let's sort of see how that plays out, right? So you remember this is the visual model that's used in your textbook in the first chapter. And one thing that's noticeable is that all of the features in the other models we've looked at are here, but cognitive is in the center. And you can see this idea about literacy events stems from the cognitive piece. And you can also see that immediately surrounding the cognitive piece is this linguistic and other sign systems, right? So this idea about language and the cognitive piece are really the two pieces that interact. So the text and the reader are the primary foci of the cognitivists. So I'm going to show you a piece from the Kusser model, because you can see here how those two things play out, right? So one thing I'm going to talk about in a second is that the cognitivists are really interested in memory, right? The workings of the brain in relationship to reading a text. So you can see up top here, you have this interplay between the script or the actual surface of the text, i.e. the language on a page, right, or on a screen. That's what you see here when you see pragmatic, the genre, the semantic, the syntactic, etc. And you see that arrow that's interacting with both short-term and long-term memory, which are interacting as well. So that you can see that the short-term memory here is activating ideas, experiences with the written code, and then long-term memory is bringing up background knowledge, both of, say, the genre, the content of the text, etc. So you have this interaction between the brain and the systems of language, which you can see here as visual information on the chart. So the surface structure interacts with non-visual, your brain's processing, its understanding about how those words are coming together to form coherence and therefore meaning, which got cut off here at the bottom. But that's the steps the brain is going through in order to construct meaning. It's utilizing what it knows about text, about script, and translating that into the stuff, the understanding. So what are cognitivists ultimately interested in? They're interested in knowledge, right? What do we know? What do we bring to the table? And then how does that knowledge play out when we're processing a text? So the other thing they're interested in is the long-term and short-term memory processes, right? So what is it that we can and cannot access when we're engaging in reading? Fluency and decoding are obviously really important. How does the brain, how do we visually perceive text, and how does the brain unpack it, decode it? They're interested in strategies, which we've talked about, and we'll talk again on your group task as well. Like, how do we structure our experiences with text? They're also interested in monitoring metacognition. They're interested in the ways in which the brain functions in the process of reading. And they're also interested in the kinds of levels of thinking we do as a result of text, for text, to construct text as well. So given those things, what I'm going to show you in terms of the innovations shouldn't be all that surprising. You should be familiar with many of them. So these are things that came out of this cognitive era, which was largely centered in the late 70s, early 80s, and then early 90s. So you see things like strategy instruction was probably the most primary innovation from the cognitive era. And your group task this week is going to take a closer look at strategy instruction. The whole idea of the gradual release of responsibility, the I do, we do, you do piece, this idea about having this structure in which you enable independence is another innovation. One thing that came a little bit before the cognitive era, but really became a central aspect of it, was what we would call a taxonomy of thinking, right? So Bloom's taxonomy is actually from the late 50s, early 60s, but depth and knowledge, a lot of the research came out of that from the early 90s, this idea that there's different levels of thinking and that the brain can be scaffolded up and down that. The idea of pre-reading, right, about activating prior knowledge became a primary concern and a major aspect of the recommendations of the literature in the 80s and 90s. We obviously still hold on to that. And then writing to learn as well. This idea here that writing and constructing our own scripts could be a way in which to process and then convey information too. Okay, so stemming from what you're going to read this week, which is going to be the chapter on Kusser, chapter 6, as well as bits of chapter 5. In your group, are you either going to read the Dole piece on cognitive strategy instruction, or you're going to read the Pete's piece on how cognitive theory applies to second language acquisition. So you can decide among your group members which one to read. You're going to write a short response for the problem of practice work that we're then going to apply in your research paper later on. And there's 3 pieces to it. Ultimately, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your problem of practice and I want you to study it in your classroom. I want you to pick a moment, a situation, a lesson, what have you, in your classroom that you can observe in connection to your problem of practice. So if you're looking at the ways in which students do work around vocabulary instruction, if that's your problem space, you should obviously then pick a moment in your classroom around vocabulary instruction or ways in which students are using their word knowledge. Again, this is in the instructions, but I would prefer something that's happened recently in the last week or so. Even better is if it's something that you actually put together or set up for later this week or early next week. So there's going to be 3 pieces. One is I just want you to describe what it is you observed, right? I want you, what is it that took place in your classroom? Give me the sense, the context of it, and how it connects to your problem of practice. In the analysis portion, I want you to talk a bit about like how what you've learned about the cognitive approach from your readings and from your group task applies to this particular situation. How do these ideas about memory and processing and the ways in which the brain works apply to this situation? And then the implications, I'm really interested in knowing what new understanding or applications you have as a result of the observation and the analysis. In other words, now that you know these things and you observe these things, what does that mean for your thinking around coming up with solutions for your problem of practice as well? And that'll be due on Tuesday later in the day. Actually, I think I made it due on Wednesday, first thing.